Here's a quick history lesson for any youngsters who might be watching. Back before Game Pass, flighting, betas, and even downloadable demos, one of the best ways to try a new game was to rent it from the video store. And if you were anything like me, you probably didn't have a disposable income, which meant you needed to rely on the charity of your parents. The worst part about this was that if you didn't like the game, you still had to play it. You had to pretend like it was good, so that your parents didn't think that they wasted their money. To make matters worse, this was before the internet. So unless you got a recommendation directly from a friend, the only way to determine whether or not a game might be good was to read about it in a magazine or to squint at the little tiny pictures on the back of the box. This is how I spent a depressing weekend pretending to enjoy super aquatic games on the Super Nintendo. To the untrained eye, it looks like a colorful platformer. It even features James Pond, the star of his own side-scrolling series on the Genesis. In reality, it's a collection of half-baked track and field-themed minigames. Now, it's worth examining each of them in their own little quirks, but first you should realize that while the game offers a practice mode, it does not give any sort of tutorial. The cipher you need to understand this nonsense is the instruction manual, which when I rented the game from Top Gun Video back in the 90s, was sadly missing. This is a big reason why I decided to revisit this title. I thought that maybe if I read up on it and learned how to actually play, I might have some fun. It just goes to show you, age and wisdom do not always go hand in hand. The Super Aquatic games features 8 different activities. Once you feel you're familiar with how they all play, you can face off against friends or CPUs in the competition mode. Although I suspect most people will give up long before then. The reason? The games range from dull to confusing to exhausting. First up is the 100-meter splash event. This is basically a race across land and through the water, although you don't need to worry about learning to swim. By mashing the A or B buttons, you move forward regardless of the terrain. To win, all you need to do is beat the frog to the finish line, but unless you set the game to easy or plug in a turbo controller, that's probably not gonna happen. Seriously though, is this kind of game ever fun? Yeah, Mario Party does it all the time, but it's usually just a quick break between dice rolls. Mashing buttons like this is actually pretty hard on controllers and tiring for your fingers. Technically the next game is the relay race, but since this one really should be at the bottom of the list, we'll save it for later and skip on ahead to shell shooting. What we have here is very different from the other offerings. It's complex and unique, but also nonsensical and maybe even totally random. Allow me to attempt to explain it. In shell shooting, the goal is to pop the balloons at the top of the screen. To do so, you need to utilize the monsters spawning from machines at either end of the room. What you're supposed to do is avoid the spiked enemies and hop on the round ones. Sometimes they're flattened, and other times they begin bouncing away. The reasons for this are unknown to me and highly aggravating. Regardless, when and if an enemy begins to bounce, you have to rush after it and position yourself underneath so that you can catch it in your bucket. And once again, the direction it flies off in seems totally random. If you do manage to catch one, you can use it as a projectile to pop the next balloon. This continues until you clear the stage, run out of time, or turn off this stupid game. Shell shooting is so awkward that even the developer playing through it for the title screen demo has trouble getting it to work. The fourth event is the bouncy castle. It also sucks. By jumping on these big sponges on the floor, you can bounce higher and higher, eventually reaching collectibles and diving boards which allow you to ascend to even greater heights. I believe the goal is to perform stunts, as evident by the display at the bottom of the screen, but the game makes no effort to explain how this is done. What's more aggravating is that the character gets stunned if he falls too far. I get that it adds a bit of realism, but given how annoying it is to have to slowly rebuild your momentum on the sponges, this seems like needless punishment. In fact, that has a nice ring to it and probably describes this event as a whole. Moving along, we come to Leapfrog, which is a lot like the 100-meter splash, but with added hurdles. If the game had a more traditional Mario-esque control scheme, it's possible to envision myself having fun jumping through this obstacle course. But since you still have to mash the A and B buttons to run, Leapfrog is not enjoyable in the slightest. You need to press them as fast as you can to even have a chance at winning, while also occasionally tapping X or Y to jump. And if you think that's bad, the next event, the Tour de Grace, is the same exact thing. The only difference is that you play as a dolphin on a unicycle, and the terrain is a little more varied. The creativity on display here is truly astounding. Feeding Time, the 7th game on the list, is mercifully different and also halfway fun. Here you play as a starfish with a bucket. The goal is to collect food from the machines to drop to the fish down below. By keeping them satisfied, they sink lower into the water, which means they won't be tempted to nibble the slowly descending fishing lines. Try your best to keep them safe, because if you lose too many fish, it's game over. I guess on paper this sounds as weird as shell shooting, but at least it's not random. And since you have to time when to refill your bucket, there's a bit of a micromanagement element to it. Continuing along with this winning streak, we come to Kipper Watching, which isn't exactly a masterpiece, but seems like one when compared to most of the game's offerings. Here you play as a seal bopping balls with his nose. The goal is to keep them away from your sleeping friends. It's a bit shallow, but the addition of different kinds of balls with varying properties and the occasional alarm clock add enough wrinkles to hold your interest, at least for a few rounds. Now finally, let's return to the relay race. As you might have guessed, this is the culmination of all the other events. You'll need to master the mechanics you've practiced across Kipper Watching, Feeding Time, and the various track and field events to succeed. And honestly, this one's okay. The different objectives help to break up what would otherwise be another button masher. And by revisiting each character, this event does manage to tie everything together in a somewhat satisfying manner. So let's summarize. Of the 8 events available, 3 are passable, and the rest are bad. What this leaves us with is a game that looks and sounds enjoyable with its vibrant visuals and energetic soundtrack, and yet it simply does not deliver. Unfortunately, this experiment hasn't really changed my opinion. If anything, it's only reinforced what I've already known to be true. This game just isn't very much fun. But hey, you don't have to take my word for it. You can try it yourself. And it won't even cost you a penny. Just grab a controller and do this. That's Super Aquatic Games. And it sucks.